My name is Evelyn Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and I never imagined the lowest point of my life wouldn't be the day I buried my father. But the week after, standing in the fluorescent-lit conference room as my team, my supposed work family, erupted in cheers for my colleague, Daniel. They were celebrating his fat bonus, a reward for the very project I'd poured my heart and soul into, the project I'd stayed up nights perfecting while my father was fading away in a hospital bed. The cheap champagne they sprayed hit the wall just inches from my head, and not a single person even glanced my way at the woman still wearing a somber navy dress, a woman whose eyes were puffy from a week of relentless tears. It was as if my grief was an invisible cloak, or worse, a party foul they were determined to ignore. Little did they know, their champagne-soaked celebration of injustice was about to be cut short by a piece of paper, a testament from a man they'd all but forgotten, a man who saw what they refused to. They thought they were toasting Daniel's success. In reality, they were just moments away from witnessing a reckoning that would strip them of their arrogant smiles. The air in that room was thick with forced merriment and the cloying scent of synthetic success. Daniel, our department's golden boy, preened under the spotlight, his grin wide and utterly oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the storm raging inside me. Mr. Albright, our manager, a man whose idea of leadership was to lavish praise on his favorites while conveniently forgetting the contributions of others, especially mine, was clapping Daniel on the back so hard I thought he might dislocate his shoulder. "To Daniel!" Albright boomed, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "For his brilliant solo effort on the Atlas Initiative, a true game-changer." Solo effort. The words were a punch to the gut. The Atlas Initiative had been my brainchild, my meticulously crafted strategy, my late nights, my weekends sacrificed. I had presented the initial framework to Albright, only to have him suggest Daniel take the lead to give him more visibility. I'd naively thought collaboration meant shared credit. How wrong I was. I remember clutching the lukewarm cup of coffee in my hands, the cheap ceramic doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. Every cheer, every congratulatory remark felt like another shovel of dirt on the coffin of my professional dignity. They were toasting him with champagne, while I was still tasting the bitter ash of loss and betrayal. My father, a man of quiet integrity, had always told me to let my work speak for itself. He'd believed in fairness, in merit. Looking at that scene, at Daniel soaking in unearned adulation, at Albright beaming like a proud peacock, I felt a surge of disillusionment so profound it almost buckled my knees. My father wouldn't have recognized this world, this corporate theater of cruelty and blatant favoritism. The silence surrounding me was deafening. Not one person asked how I was doing. Not one person offered a word of condolence, even though the entire office knew my father had passed. It was as if acknowledging my grief would somehow taint their celebration. I was a ghost at their feast, a specter of sorrow they chose to look right through. But here's the thing about being underestimated, about being rendered invisible. It gives you a unique vantage point. You see things others don't. You hear things they miss. And while they were busy patting each other on the back, I was thinking about Mr. Harrison, the elderly, almost mythical founder of our company. A man I'd shared quiet cups of tea with on my lunch breaks, listening to his stories, sharing my ideas not for advancement, but because he was one of the few people who genuinely listened. They all thought he was just a senile old relic, a figurehead. They had no idea he was my silent mentor, my anchor in that toxic sea. And they certainly had no idea that his recently deceased solicitor was scheduled to arrive later that very afternoon for the reading of his final will and testament. A will that concerned the future of the entire company. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, far richer and more satisfying than their cheap champagne. They were celebrating a stolen victory, oblivious to the fact that the real game was about to begin, and the rules were about to change dramatically. Have you ever felt that sting of being completely overlooked, your hard work credited to someone else, especially when you were already down? It's a uniquely painful experience, isn't it? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about it, because knowing you're not alone makes a world of difference. And trust me, you'll want to subscribe to find out how their laughter turned to stunned silence. The Atlas Initiative wasn't the first time Daniel had surfed the wave of my hard work, nor was it the first instance of Mr. Albright's selective amnesia when it came to my contributions. It was just the most brazen, the most painful, especially given the timing. For 5 years at Sterling Financial, I'd navigated a landscape where my ideas were often met with polite nods, only to resurface later, slightly repackaged from Daniel's lips, at which point Albright would declare them innovative and exactly what the company needs. I remember the Phoenix account, a major client we were on the verge of losing 2 years ago. I'd spent weeks, unpaid overtime bleeding into my personal life, analyzing their portfolio, identifying pain points, and crafting a bespoke retention strategy. I presented it in a team meeting. Albright had seemed distracted, more interested in the new golf clubs Daniel was boasting about earlier. The next day, Daniel presented his version of my strategy, essentially my slides with a different font and his name on them, to Albright privately. Suddenly, it was a stroke of genius. Daniel got a commendation. I got a pat on the back for being a good team player when I'd mildly protested that the core ideas were mine. Albright had said, "Evelyn, we're all a team here. Daniel just has a knack for articulating these things for senior management." Articulating. As if I, with my detailed reports and clear presentations, was somehow incapable of clear communication. The subtle sexism in that statement wasn't lost on me. Daniel was decisive and a leader. I was just detailed. Then there was the Q3 efficiency overhaul. I'd identified redundancies in our workflow, proposed a streamlined process that would save the company thousands annually. I submitted a comprehensive report. Weeks went by. Nothing. Then, at the quarterly review, Albright announced Daniel's proactive initiative to improve efficiency, citing a few bullet points that were laughably similar to my executive summary. When I tried to speak up to show my original report, Albright cut me off, saying, "Evelyn, Daniel took the initiative to champion this. We need more of that go-getter attitude." He made it sound like I was just a complainer, not the originator. Daniel, of course, just smiled. That self-satisfied smirk that made my blood boil. He never once acknowledged my input, not even privately. He bathed in the stolen glory, no questions asked. It wasn't just the big projects, it was the daily grind. In meetings, my suggestions would often hang in the air, unacknowledged, until Daniel or another male colleague rephrased them, at which point they'd become brilliant. My requests for resources were often met with budget constraints, while Daniel seemed to have an open tap. He got the plum assignments, the client-facing opportunities, the mentorship from senior partners, all orchestrated by Albright, who saw Daniel as a younger version of himself. I was the workhorse, expected to toil in the background, generating the raw material for Daniel's star to rise. The atmosphere Albright fostered was one of quiet sycophancy. You played his game, you laughed at his bad jokes, you admired his chosen ones, and you might get a few crumbs. If you were like me, focused on the work, on integrity, on actual results rather than office politics, you were sidelined. My performance reviews were always satisfactory, with vague comments like "needs to improve visibility" or "could be more assertive in promoting her achievements." How could I promote achievements that were constantly being credited to someone else? It was a catch-22 designed to keep me in my place. The stress was immense. I'd go home feeling drained, not from the work itself, which I genuinely enjoyed, but from the constant battle for recognition, the feeling of being gaslighted. There were nights I'd stare at my ceiling, replaying interactions, wondering if I was being too sensitive, if I was imagining the slights. But then another project would be hijacked, another idea borrowed, and the pattern would reassert itself, clear and undeniable. When my father got sick, work became an even more complicated space. I needed the distraction, the sense of normalcy, but the injustices felt sharper, more intolerable. I was dealing with real, life-altering pain at home, and then I'd walk into the office and have to fight for basic acknowledgement. The Atlas Initiative was supposed to be different. It was complex, it required deep strategic thinking, and I knew I was the best person for it. I presented the initial 50-page proposal to Albright, filled with market analysis, risk assessment, and a multi-phase implementation plan. He'd seemed impressed, genuinely so for a moment. "This is good, Evelyn. Very thorough, he'd said. Then, a week later, he called me into his office. About the Atlas Initiative, he began. I think it's a great opportunity for Daniel to step up, show some leadership. You can support him, of course. Provide him with your research. My research, my strategy, my project. I remember feeling a cold dread creep over me. I tried to argue, to state my case, but he was firm. Daniel needs this for his career progression, Evelyn. You understand. I didn't understand. I understood that once again, I was being relegated to the role of a ghostwriter for someone else's success story. And Daniel, when informed, just gave me that familiar, entitled smile. Great to be working with you on this, Ev. Make sure to send over all your notes. He didn't even pretend it was a collaboration. The audacity was breathtaking. And so, I worked, pouring everything I had left into it, partly for my own pride, partly because my father had always taught me to do my best, no matter what. I'd foolishly hoped that the sheer quality and undeniable authorship of my contribution would shine through. That celebration, so soon after my father's funeral, was the final, brutal confirmation of how utterly wrong I had been. They weren't just ignoring my work, they were ignoring my humanity. Amidst that relentless tide of disregard, there was one person, an island of quiet sanity and genuine acknowledgement. Mr. Alistair Harrison, the founder of Sterling Financial. To most of the office, especially the newer generation like Daniel, and even Albright, who only saw him as a name on the letterhead, Mr. Harrison was a relic, a charming but largely ceremonial figure who occasionally wandered the halls, a benign ghost from a bygone era. They'd offer him patronizing smiles, a quick dismissive "Good morning, Mr. H," before hurrying back to their important work. They had no idea of the sharpness that still glinted in his pale blue eyes, the keen intellect that lay behind his soft-spoken words. Our encounters began quite by accident. The company cafeteria was usually a cacophony of forced networking and gossip, a place I avoided. Instead, I often took my lunch to a small, forgotten alcove near the old archives, a quiet space with a dusty window overlooking a surprisingly green patch of City Park. One day, Mr. Harrison was there, nursing a cup of tea and looking out the same window. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just offered a gentle smile and a nod. I, on the other hand, was mortified, thinking I'd intruded on the company patriarch. I mumbled an apology and started to leave, but he gestured for me to stay. "Nonsense, my dear," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's a big enough window for two lonely souls." And so it began. Almost every other day, if his health permitted and he was in the office, we'd share that quiet space. He rarely spoke about current company business directly, at least not in terms of specific projects or people initially. Instead, he'd talk about the early days of Sterling Financial, the principles he'd built it on: integrity, client trust, valuing innovation from every level. He'd ask me about my day, not in a superficial way, but with genuine interest. He'd listen, truly listen, as I carefully described the challenges I was working on, the ideas I was developing, ideas that often got re-articulated by Daniel later. Mr. Harrison never commented directly on Albright or Daniel in those early days, but he had a way of looking at me, a knowing glint in his eye, that told me he saw more than I was saying, or what was being said by others. He'd ask probing questions, not to interrogate, but to make me think deeper, to encourage me to trust my own judgment. "And what are the long-term implications of that strategy, Evelyn?" he might inquire. Or, "How would you counter that particular market shift you've identified?" He treated my intellect with respect, a currency I found scarce from my direct superiors. He'd often share anecdotes from his own career, stories of overcoming adversity, of sticking to his principles even when it was difficult, or when others took easier, less scrupulous paths. They weren't lectures, but parables, rich with unspoken lessons, and I absorbed them like a sponge, drawing strength from his quiet resilience. As our unlikely friendship developed, I started to cautiously share some of my frustrations, not overtly complaining, but hinting at the roadblocks, the way ideas seemed to get lost or misappropriated. He'd nod slowly, his gaze thoughtful, never interrupting. "The cream always rises to the top, Evelyn," he once said, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes it just takes a little longer, and the churning can be unpleasant. But keep churning. Keep producing quality. Character, like good whiskey, needs time to mature and prove its worth. Don't let the noise distract you from the work. It was his way of encouraging me, of telling me not to give up, not to let the system or the opportunists grind me down. He made me feel seen, truly seen, for my efforts and my potential. He saw the Atlas Initiative proposal, not the version Albright eventually paraded as Daniel's, but my original detailed document. I'd been working late one evening, a few weeks before my father's health took its final, serious turn, and Mr. Harrison had been in the office, a rare occurrence for him at that hour. He saw the light on in my cubicle and came by, leaning on his old polished cane. He asked what I was working on with such intensity. Hesitantly, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension, I showed him the printout. He sat down in my spare chair, put on his reading glasses, and spent nearly an hour poring over it, page by page. He didn't say much, just an occasional or interesting, or a soft tapping of his finger on a particular chart. When he finished, he looked at me over the rims of his glasses, a serious but kind expression on his face. "This is exceptional work, Evelyn," he said, his voice firm and clear. "This is the kind of thinking Sterling Financial was built on. This is vision. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and don't let anyone diminish it." Coming from him, the man who had built the company from the ground up, those words were like a shield, a validation that resonated far deeper than any superficial praise from Albright ever could. He knew about my father's illness. During those last few months, when I was stretched thin, emotionally and physically, juggling hospital visits with the demands of the Atlas Project, our quiet lunches, or sometimes just a shared cup of tea in that alcove, became even more important. He wouldn't pry, but he'd ask, "How are you holding up, my dear?" with such genuine compassion that sometimes it was all I could do not to break down. He'd share stories of his own losses, his own struggles with balancing life's cruelties with professional demands, making me feel less alone in my grief and stress. He never offered platitudes, just quiet understanding and a steady presence. He'd often say, "Focus on what truly matters, Evelyn. Work is important, it gives structure and purpose, but family, integrity, those are the foundations of a life well lived." The rest of the office, Albright included, saw him as a figurehead, slightly senile, out of touch with the modern pace of business. They humored him when he was around, then likely forgot about him the moment he left the room. They had no idea of the conversations we had, the depth of his perception, or the sharpness of his mind that still lurked beneath that gentle exterior. They didn't know he saw right through their charades, their petty power plays, their sycophantic maneuvering. He was my secret ally, my silent champion. He never intervened directly with Albright on my behalf. I don't think that was his style, and perhaps he knew it wouldn't have worked with a man like Albright anyway, might even have made things worse for me in the short term. Instead, he empowered me from within, validated my worth, and in his own quiet way let me know that true value is eventually recognized, even if it's not by those immediately around you, those too blinded by their own ambition or biases. His belief in me was a quiet, steady flame that kept my own hope from being extinguished by the constant gales of injustice in that office. And as I stood there in that conference room, watching Daniel preen and Albright toast to a stolen victory, I clutched onto the memory of Mr. Harrison's words, his quiet confidence in me. They had no idea how deeply he saw, or how far his influence might still reach, even from beyond the grave. His wisdom, his faith in me, was the armor I wore, unseen by them, as I braced for whatever came next. While Albright and Daniel were busy constructing their narrative of Daniel's brilliance, built on the foundations of my unseen labor, I wasn't just passively enduring. Mr. Harrison's quiet encouragement, his faith in my abilities, had planted a seed. It wasn't a seed of immediate rebellion. I knew the corporate game, at least Albright's version of it, too well for that. Instead, it was a seed of quiet preparation, of strategic patience. His words, "Character, like good whiskey, needs time to mature and prove its worth," echoed in my mind. So I began my own silent rise, not for them, but for myself, and perhaps for the legacy Mr. Harrison believed in. During the development of the Atlas Initiative, Even as I was handing over meticulously detailed reports and strategic outlines to Daniel, knowing they'd be presented as his, I started documenting everything. Every email, every memo, every draft, every single contribution I made was carefully archived, dated, and cross-referenced. I created a parallel file, a shadow project, that detailed my original concepts, my research, my strategic thinking, and the evolution of the project under my initial guidance. It wasn't just about proving authorship for this one project. It was about building an undeniable record of my capabilities, a testament to the work they so readily dismissed or attributed elsewhere. I learned to CC myself on crucial emails, to save versions of documents before Daniel's refinements, to keep a meticulous personal log of my hours and tasks specifically related to the initiative. It felt almost clandestine, but I knew deep down that in a system rigged against me, I needed my own irrefutable evidence. Beyond the Atlas Initiative, I began to subtly cultivate relationships outside of Albright's immediate sphere of influence. Mr. Harrison, in his gentle way, had sometimes mentioned other senior figures in the company, people from different departments, or even retired board members he still kept in touch with. Old Henderson in legal, sharp as a tack, always valued thoroughness, he might say. Or Eleanor Vance used to head up our international desk, brilliant strategist. I started to find organic reasons to interact with these individuals, offering assistance on cross-departmental tasks, sharing relevant articles or insights that I knew would resonate with their areas of expertise. I wasn't schmoozing or playing political games. I was genuinely connecting with people who, like Mr. Harrison, seemed to value substance over style. I wanted them to know my work, my mind, independent of Albright's skewed portrayal. I also dedicated my evenings and weekends, not just to the Atlas Initiative's demands, but to my own professional development. I took online courses in advanced financial modeling, in corporate governance, in leadership strategies, areas where I knew I could excel but was rarely given the opportunity to demonstrate within Albright's team. I read industry journals voraciously, staying ahead of trends, formulating my own perspectives on the future of finance. It wasn't just about acquiring knowledge. It was about building an arsenal of expertise that no one could take away from me, regardless of who got credit for the daily tasks. I was fortifying myself, becoming undeniable. During my father's illness, this silent work became a strange kind of solace. The hours spent at his bedside were filled with a quiet grief, but the hours I stole for my own silent rise were a way of channeling that pain into something constructive, a way of honoring his belief in hard work and integrity. He wouldn't have wanted me to be a victim of circumstance, and he certainly wouldn't have wanted me to let others define my worth. So, I studied, I documented, I networked discreetly, all while outwardly maintaining the facade of the diligent, if somewhat overlooked, employee. Mr. Harrison himself played a more direct, albeit still discreet role in this than I even realized at the time. About 6 months before he passed, during one of our tea sessions, he'd been unusually pensive. He spoke about the future of Sterling Financial, his concerns about its direction, about the erosion of some of the core values he'd instilled. He mentioned that he was updating his personal arrangements and, almost as an aside, asked me some very specific questions about my long-term career aspirations, my vision for what a truly ethical and innovative financial institution should look like. I answered him honestly, passionately, sharing ideas I'd never dared voice in Albright's presence. He listened intently, nodding, asking a few clarifying questions. At the time, I thought it was just one of his philosophical musings. I had no idea he was, in his own way, vetting me, gauging my understanding not just of finance, but of leadership and legacy. He also, on a couple of occasions, facilitated introductions that seemed casual at the time, but were, in retrospect, quite strategic. He once invited me to join him for a lunch where an old friend of his, a highly respected and influential figure in the city's financial circles, was present. Mr. Harrison subtly guided the conversation, allowing me to speak about my analytical work, my market insights. I remember the friend, a Mr. Ashworth, looking at me with a keen, appraising eye. These weren't job interviews, but they were opportunities for my capabilities to be seen by people whose opinions mattered, people outside the toxic bubble of my department. So, while Daniel was basking in the glow of Albright's favor, and the team was celebrating his achievements, I was building my own quiet power. It wasn't a power derived from office politics or schmoozing, but from competence, from meticulous preparation, and from the quiet, unwavering support of an unexpected ally. I was laying the groundwork, piece by piece, for a future they couldn't control, a future where my value would be undeniable. The pain of my father's loss was immense. The sting of their callousness at that celebration was sharp, but beneath it all, there was a growing resolve, a quiet confidence born of this hidden preparation. They thought I was just the grieving, overlooked workhorse. They had no idea I was also a student of the game, patiently waiting for the right moment, armed with evidence and the quiet endorsement of the one man who truly understood the soul of the company. The champagne flutes were still half full. Daniel was mid-sentence, likely recounting some fabricated anecdote of his solo brilliance on the Atlas Initiative, and Albright was beaming, his face flushed with vicarious pride, when Mr. Albright's assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah, poked her head into the conference room. "Mr. Albright, sir," she stammered. "Mr. Davies is here. From Fletcher & Davies, Mr. Harrison's solicitors? He said it's urgent regarding the reading of the will." A sudden hush fell over the room. The celebratory mood evaporated, replaced by a confused, slightly apprehensive curiosity. Mr. Harrison had passed away nearly 2 weeks prior, a quiet affair that most of the office had barely registered beyond a company-wide email. His will? Why here, why now, and why was it urgent? Albright, looking momentarily flustered, smoothed his tie. "Ah, yes, Davies. Right. Well, send him in, Sarah. I suppose we can accommodate him." He clearly thought it was some minor formality, perhaps a charitable donation mentioned in the will, something to be dealt with quickly before resuming Daniel's coronation. Mr. Davies was the antithesis of the boisterous celebration. He was a tall, somber man in a perfectly tailored dark suit, carrying an old leather briefcase that seemed to command respect. His gaze swept over the room, lingering for a moment on the half-eaten cake and the discarded party poppers, a hint of disapproval in his cool gray eyes. He didn't acknowledge anyone individually, just set his briefcase on the polished mahogany table with a soft thud that seemed to silence even the air-conditioning hum. "Good afternoon," Mr. Davies began, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the residual awkwardness. "I am Julian Davies, senior partner at Fletcher & Davies and the executor of the late Mr. Alastair Harrison's estate. I apologize for the intrusion, but Mr. Harrison's instructions were quite specific regarding the timing and audience for a particular codicil to his will." He paused, letting his words sink in. Audience? Codicil. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Albright, trying to regain control, puffed out his chest slightly. "Of course, Mr. Davies. We were just celebrating a departmental success, but please proceed." He gestured vaguely around the room, as if to imply they were all very important people, accustomed to such high-level briefings. Mr. Davies opened his briefcase and retrieved a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. "Mr. Harrison, in the months leading up to his passing, made several amendments to his final will and testament. The codicil I am about to read pertains specifically to the future leadership and controlling interest of Sterling Financial." A collective intake of breath. Controlling interest? This was far more than a charitable donation. I saw Daniel's smirk falter, replaced by a look of keen, almost greedy interest. Albright leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I thought of Mr. Harrison's pensive moods, his questions about my vision for the company. Could it be? "Before I read the relevant section," Mr. Davies continued, his gaze sweeping across us once more, finally settling on me for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Mr. Harrison instructed me to provide some context. He was deeply concerned about the preservation of the core values upon which he built this company: integrity, innovation, driven by merit, and a commitment to ethical practices. He felt that these values were at risk. Albright shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Daniel looked down at his champagne flute, suddenly less celebratory. The rest of the team exchanged nervous glances. "This codicil, Mr. Davies said, breaking the seal with a decisive flick of his thumb, is his final act to safeguard that legacy." He cleared his throat and began to read. "I, Alistair James Harrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this as a codicil to my last will and testament. Regarding my majority shareholding in Sterling Financial, representing 55% of the company's total equity," he paused, and the silence was so profound I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. "I bequeath the entirety of this controlling interest, along with the chairmanship of the board of Sterling Financial, effective immediately upon my passing, to a person who has consistently demonstrated the intellectual rigor, the strategic foresight, the unwavering integrity, and the quiet dedication that I always envisioned for the leadership of this company." The room was frozen. 55%. The chairmanship. This wasn't just a bequest. It was a complete restructuring of power. Albright looked like he was about to have an apoplexy. His face had gone from flushed to a pale, mottled gray. Daniel stared, open-mouthed, his earlier triumph completely forgotten. Mr. Davies continued, his voice steady and unwavering. "A person who, despite being consistently undervalued and often overlooked by those in positions of immediate authority, has nevertheless continued to produce work of exceptional quality and strategic importance. A person whose vision for the future of this company aligns with my own founding principles." He paused again, a master of dramatic timing. "This person is Ms. Evelyn Hayes." For a moment, there was absolute stunned silence. Then, a gasp from Sarah, who was still hovering by the door. Albright made a choking sound. Daniel's jaw literally dropped. He looked from Mr. Davies to me, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning horror. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. No one moved to clean it up. I felt a wave of dizziness, but also a strange, profound calm. It was happening. Mr. Harrison's quiet faith, his unseen plan, was unfolding. I looked at Albright. His face was a mask of disbelief, rapidly morphing into outrage. He started to sputter. This is preposterous! An outrage! Evelyn Hayes? She's just a junior analyst. There must be some mistake." Mr. Davies fixed Albright with an icy stare. "There is no mistake, Mr. Albright. The codicil is legally binding, witnessed, and notarized. Mr. Harrison was very clear in his intentions. He also left a personal letter for Ms. Hayes and several sealed directives for the board, which Ms. Hayes, as the new chairwoman, will be privy to." He then turned to me, a hint of a smile finally touching his lips. "Ms. Hayes, Mr. Harrison also stipulated that your first act as chairwoman should be a full review of the Atlas Initiative, including its true authorship and the subsequent allocation of bonuses." He left rather detailed notes on that matter as well. The color drained completely from Daniel's face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. He stared at me, no longer with arrogance, but with a raw, naked fear. Albright was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The rest of the team just stared, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and for a few, a dawning, reluctant respect. The cheap champagne celebration was well and truly over. The air was no longer filled with synthetic merriment, but with the undeniable, earth-shattering weight of truth and a seismic shift in power. The silent rise had reached its crescendo, and the sound was deafening. If this story of an unexpected turn of fortune resonates with you, or if you've ever dreamed of a moment where the tables are dramatically turned, hit that like button to support more stories like this. It really helps the channel grow. The days that followed the reading of Mr. Harrison's will were a whirlwind, but amidst the chaos of assuming my new role, one thing was crystal clear. The dynamics at Sterling Financial had irrevocably changed. The first order of business, as Mr. Harrison had so pointedly suggested, was the Atlas Initiative. Mr. Davies provided me with Mr. Harrison's sealed notes, which, to my quiet satisfaction, included copies of my original proposal that he'd somehow obtained and kept, alongside a scathing, albeit politely worded, assessment of how the project had been managed and credit misattributed. Armed with this, and my own meticulously compiled evidence, the review was swift and decisive. I convened a meeting with the board, the existing members, now my subordinates, and Mr. Albright. Daniel was also required to attend. The atmosphere was starkly different from the champagne-soaked conference room. There was no forced merriment here, only a tense, formal sobriety. I laid out the evidence, calmly and methodically. My initial detailed proposal, the email trails, the version histories of documents, and Mr. Harrison's own observations. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves, a damning indictment of the culture Albright had fostered. When I finished, the silence was heavy. Albright, who had attempted a few blustering interruptions early on, Sathan-faced, his usual arrogance completely deflated. Daniel looked physically ill, avoiding eye contact with everyone. I then announced the board's decision, which, under my new authority as chairwoman and majority shareholder, was essentially my decision. The bonus awarded to Daniel for the Atlas Initiative was to be rescinded and officially reallocated to me as the project's true architect. Furthermore, a formal, written apology from Daniel to me, acknowledging his misrepresentation of his role, was required. And for Mr. Albright, his leadership of the department was under immediate and serious review. His days of playing favorites and coasting on the work of others were over. The fallout was immediate. Daniel, stripped of his unearned glory and bonus, looked utterly broken. He mumbled a barely audible apology in the meeting, his eyes fixed on the table. Later that week, he submitted his resignation. Good riddance. He was a product of a flawed system, and without Albright's protection and my stolen ideas, he had little of substance to offer. Mr. Albright tried a different tactic. The day after the board meeting, he requested a private meeting with me. He entered my new, much larger office, Mr. Harrison's old office, in fact, with an uncharacteristic humility, or at least a convincing performance of it. "Evelyn," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity that made my skin crawl. "I realize now that I may have misjudged things. I was under a lot of pressure, and perhaps I didn't give your contributions the visibility they deserved. I truly am sorry. I hope we can move forward, work together. I've always valued your thoroughness." I let him finish, my expression unreadable. The man who had dismissed my grief, who had actively participated in the theft of my work, who had for years fostered an environment where I was made to feel small and insignificant, was now attempting to salvage his career with a pathetic, self-serving apology. I remembered all the times I'd felt that knot of frustration in my stomach, the sting of injustice, the quiet despair. "Mr. Albright," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I appreciate you sharing your perspective. However, thoroughness, as you call it, is just one aspect of competence. Integrity, fairness, and the ability to recognize and nurture talent, regardless of personal preference, are also crucial qualities for leadership. Qualities which, frankly, have been conspicuously absent in your management style." I told him that his position was untenable. His review would indeed be thorough, conducted by an external HR consultant I was bringing in, and would examine his entire tenure, not just the Atlas Initiative. I made it clear that the culture of favoritism and idea theft was ending, effective immediately. He tried to argue, to plead, but the power dynamic had shifted entirely. He was no longer the kingmaker. He was a liability. Within a month, following the consultant's damning report, Mr. Albright was quietly, but firmly, encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. The rest of the team from that fateful celebration? Their reactions were mixed. Some, the sycophants who had hitched their wagons to Daniel and Albright, were clearly nervous, their fawning attempts to suddenly ingratiate themselves with me, transparent and, frankly, pathetic. I made it clear that performance and integrity were the new currencies at Sterling Financial. Others, who had perhaps remained silent out of fear or a desire to simply keep their heads down, approached me quietly, expressing relief at the changes, some even offering belated and seemingly genuine apologies for not speaking up sooner about the injustices they'd witnessed. I accepted these with a polite nod. Trust would need to be rebuilt, on both sides. I didn't seek revenge in a malicious way. I didn't need to scream or publicly humiliate them further than their own actions and the subsequent revelations already had. My revenge was in the restoration of fairness, in the dismantling of a toxic system, in the quiet, decisive assertion of my rightful place. It was in ensuring that the values Mr. Harrison cherished, and that my own father had taught me, became the guiding principles of the company he had built. The personal letter Mr. Harrison left for me was deeply moving. He wrote of his quiet observations over the years, his admiration for my resilience and intellect, his hope that I would steer the company back to its core principles. He even mentioned our shared cups of tea in the alcove, calling them some of the most insightful business meetings he'd had in years. Reading his words, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the incredible opportunity he had given me, but for his belief in me when so few others had. It was a validation that went far beyond any corporate title or financial gain. I set new boundaries. False apologies were not entertained. Credit was given where it was due, loudly and publicly. New policies were implemented to ensure transparency in project assignments and performance evaluations. The work environment began to shift, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, from one of fear and favoritism to one of respect and genuine collaboration. My grief for my father remained, a dull ache that would likely never fully disappear. But it was now mingled with a sense of purpose, a determination to build something worthy of both his memory and Mr. Harrison's legacy. The celebration they'd had at my expense had indeed been cut short, and in its place, a new, more just era for Sterling Financial had begun. Looking back on that tumultuous period, from the depths of grief and professional humiliation to the unexpected inheritance of Sterling Financial, I realized my journey was about so much more than just corporate vindication. It was a profound lesson in the nature of true value, resilience, and the quiet power of integrity in a world that often seems to reward superficiality and opportunism. For years, I had allowed others to define my worth, to diminish my contributions, to make me question my own abilities. I had internalized their narrative, believing that perhaps I wasn't assertive enough, not visible enough, not enough. The pain of my father's passing, compounded by the callousness of my colleagues, was a brutal crucible, but it also burned away a lot of those self-doubts. It forced me to see the stark reality of the environment I was in and to finally acknowledge the injustice I had endured for too long. Mr. Harrison's incredible act of faith wasn't just a gift of wealth or power. It was the ultimate validation. He saw what others refused to see, not because I was suddenly different, but because he possessed the wisdom to look beyond the surface, to recognize substance over showmanship. He understood that true leadership isn't about self-promotion or cultivating favorites. It's about vision, competence, and an unwavering commitment to ethical principles. His legacy became my mandate, to build a company where talent is nurtured, where ideas are valued based on merit, and where integrity is not just a buzzword, but the bedrock of our operations. The transformation at Sterling Financial hasn't always been easy. Changing an entrenched culture takes time, patience, and unwavering resolve. There were moments of resistance, moments of doubt, but the memory of Mr. Harrison's quiet confidence and the values my father instilled in me always served as my compass. We're not perfect, but we are building a workplace where people feel seen, heard, and respected for their contributions, not for their ability to play political games. We celebrate genuine achievements, not stolen ones. And we certainly don't celebrate at the expense of someone else's grief. This journey taught me that empowerment isn't something that's handed to you. It's something you cultivate within yourself, even in the face of adversity. It's about recognizing your own worth, even when no one else does. It's about doing the work meticulously and with integrity, even when you're not getting the credit. It's about building your own silent rise brick by brick, because you never know when an unexpected ally or an unforeseen circumstance will provide the opportunity for that quiet strength to be revealed to the world. My story is just one story, but I know so many of you out there have faced similar situations, felt that sting of being undervalued, of having your ideas dismissed or stolen, of being made to feel invisible in a workplace that should have recognized your potential. What would you have done in my place, standing in that conference room, watching them celebrate a lie while your heart was breaking? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you have your own story of overcoming workplace injustice, of finding your voice, or of an unexpected turn that led to your triumph, please share it. Let's create a community here where we can lift each other up, remind each other of our inherent worth, and show the world that resilience and integrity do, in the end, prevail. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of turnaround and empowerment. Your voice matters, your work matters, and you are not alone.